Story 1. The Stranger Under the Bed. I grew up in a high ranch house, and since I was the oldest and only boy, my parents gave me the downstairs bedroom. The room was a bit secluded, away from the rest of the family, and had its own bathroom. When I turned 10, I upgraded to a full-sized bed, and at 12, I started staying home alone more often. This was around the time I began having odd, restless nights. For 3 nights straight, I'd wake up for no apparent reason, each time feeling an eerie unease I couldn't shake. On one of those nights, I got up to refill my water and heard a noise coming from my room. I turned off the faucet, listening intently, but there was only silence. I shrugged it off, but something about my room felt off. Unsettled, I decided to sleep upstairs on the couch. The next night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I fell asleep to the steady hum of the air conditioning. But once again, I woke up suddenly, only this time I was sure I heard something breathing. It wasn't mine. This breathing was deep, slow, and way too close. Scanning the room, I noticed my closet door was shut, so I ruled that out. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself it had to be my younger sister playing a prank. I looked under the bed, and that's when I froze. There, nestled into a pile of blankets, was a large, dirty-looking man lying completely still with his eyes shut, just inches away. I stumbled backward in shock, scrambling toward the door while screaming for my dad. I pointed frantically, gasping, under the bed. My dad stormed in, grabbed the man, and dragged him out while my mom called 911. We threw out everything in the fridge afterward, just in case he had tampered with anything. I still shiver at the thought that this stranger might have been hiding under my bed for days. Story 2. My great-grandfather's encounter during WWII. My great-grandfather, now over 100 years old, has told this story at every family gathering for as long as I can remember. During World War II, he was stationed with the Soviet Army in a freezing, desolate part of the Russian front. One night after a particularly brutal battle, he and a friend, Sergei, were celebrating indoors, grateful for the warmth of an undamaged building. At some point, they decided to step outside for a cigarette, pulling their coats tight against the biting cold. As they smoked, a chilling scream rang out from the woods nearby. Fearing one of their comrades was in trouble, they rushed back inside to grab their rifles, gathering several other soldiers before venturing into the dark forest. As they moved deeper into the woods, a strange feeling of dread settled over my great-grandfather, an instinct that told him to turn back. But they pressed on, splitting into pairs to cover more ground. It wasn't long before he and Sergei began to hear a faint, agonized crying. Following the sound, they came upon a horrific scene. The German soldiers lay slumped in the snow, one dead and the other barely alive, muttering in a language my great-grandfather didn't understand. The dead soldier's body was mutilated, his uniform torn and face horribly disfigured. The smell that hung over the scene wasn't the usual odor of death, it was something sharper, chemical, almost metallic. Just as they approached the surviving soldier, he looked up, eyes wild with fear, shouting something like Das Kalaus. Before they could get any answers, Sergei ended the German soldier's misery with a single shot. At that moment, they heard something, a low, moaning sound, followed by a figure darting through the trees. They fired into the darkness, but whatever it was slipped away, leaving only the eerie silence of the frozen forest. To this day, my great-grandfather says that encounter was the most terrifying moment of his life. Whatever lurked in those woods that night still haunts his nightmares. Story 3. The Stranger in the Backyard. My fiancée, Morgan, and I had just moved into a quiet, small-town home when something happened that still keeps us both on edge. We were in the middle of unpacking and settling in, and one evening, Morgan was cooking pasta while I browsed for furniture on my laptop. It was a bit stuffy, so I went to slide open the back door when I noticed a figure in the yard, a man sitting on one of our patio chairs, hunched over. Almost shouted, but instead I whispered for Morgan not to scream. We both stood there, trying to decide what to do. He hadn't moved or seemed to notice us, even though he had to know we were there. Morgan suggested I knock on the glass, so I did, calling out, "Hey, you need to leave." The man turned around, smiling faintly, and then got up and walked straight toward us, stopping just on the other side of the glass. Up close, he looked about 50 with a scruffy gray beard and tattoos snaking down his arms. His gaze shifted from me to Morgan, and then he started whispering things I could only describe as vile. told him I was calling the police, but that only made him chuckle. Morgan pulled the blinds shut, but we could still hear him talking on the other side of the door, now louder and even more disgusting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he fell silent. But later that night, while we were trying to unwind, I heard a noise in the yard. I peeked through the blinds and felt my stomach drop. There he was again, staring at the house, muttering to himself. He saw me watching, and this time he ran to the window, pounding and shouting obscenities about Morgan. I told her to go upstairs while I stayed downstairs, waiting phone in hand, ready to call the police. For a tense silence, I heard him jiggling the back door handle, trying to get in. I called 911 immediately, and within minutes, officers arrived to check the yard. But the man had vanished into the darkness. They took our statement, and we didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, we talked to our neighbors and discovered the man was known for his violent tendencies and had a reputation around town as troubled. Even so, the police couldn't press charges without physical evidence. We haven't seen him since, and I hope we never do, but even now, every noise outside makes us hold our breath, wondering if he might come back. Story 4, The Late Night Visitor. About a year ago, I lived in a cramped but cozy apartment on the top floor of an old building in the city. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was all I could afford while working a late-night job downtown. Most nights, I'd get home around midnight, shower, and unwind with some TV before falling asleep. The neighborhood wasn't exactly upscale, but it was safe enough, or so I thought. One night, after a long shift, I came home and went through my usual routine. Just as I was about to turn off the lights and head to bed, I heard a faint knocking. I figured it had to be my neighbor or someone who had the wrong door, but something felt off. I stayed still, waiting to see if the sound would stop, but it only got louder, more insistent. I hesitated, feeling a chill run down my spine, and finally went to check the peephole. Outside my door stood a man in his early 40s, wearing a dark hoodie, with his hood pulled up just enough to hide his face. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and he was rocking back and forth almost rhythmically, as if he were waiting for me to answer. I didn't open the door, just called out, "Can I help you?" But he didn't respond. Just stood there, still swaying slightly, and after a long silence, he finally spoke. "Let me in. I just need to talk to you. Please, let me in." My stomach dropped. I told him I was calling the police, hoping that would scare him off. But he just started whispering something I couldn't make out. It was like he was chanting, his voice soft and creepy, each word dripping with malice. I backed away from the door, heart pounding, and dialed 911. While I was on the phone with the operator, the knocking stopped. But when I checked the peephole again, he was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe he'd finally left. But as I turned to walk back to my bedroom, a soft tapping started on my bedroom window. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It was on the top floor. There was no way someone could be outside that window. Slowly, I turned around, and through the thin blinds, I saw the shadow of a figure standing just outside. How he got there, I still don't know, but I can't shake the memory of that shadowy figure waiting outside my window, even after the police arrived and searched the building, finding no trace of him. I moved out a month later, but even now, I sleep with my windows tightly locked, half expecting that knock to start up again in the dead of night. Story 5, The Last Shift. I used to work as a night guard at a small office complex. The place was nothing special, 3 stories, a bunch of dimly lit corridors, and an empty parking lot. My job was pretty straightforward. Check the doors, monitor the cameras, and keep everything locked up until morning. One night, it was unusually quiet, and the empty hallways had an eerie stillness to them. Around 3 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, thinking maybe one of the employees had stayed late, but no one was there. Shrugging it off, I went back to my desk to monitor the cameras. Just as I settled in, I noticed movement on the screen. On one of the monitors, a figure appeared in the basement hallway, a woman, wearing what looked like a white hospital gown. She moved slowly, her back to the camera, but something about the way she moved sent a shiver down my spine. I tried switching to a different angle to get a better look, but the camera feed cut out. I stared at the screen, willing it to come back on, and after a few tense moments, the feed returned. The hallway was empty. Still shaken, I continued my rounds. I had almost convinced myself it was just a glitch, a trick of the camera, until I heard footsteps again. This time, they sounded louder, coming from the hallway I just checked. I crept down the corridor, heart pounding, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I turned a corner, my beam landed on her, the woman from the camera, standing at the end of the hallway. I stopped dead, frozen with fear, as she turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and her face was twisted into a look of pure anguish. Then, without a sound, she vanished, leaving me staring down an empty corridor. I quit the next day, and to this day, think she was real or just some remnant of the building's past, replaying her final moments in that lonely hallway. Story 6, the tunnel beneath the house. Growing up, my best friend Tom lived in an old house on the edge of town. The house had been in his family for generations, and it had all kinds of quirky, creepy features, including a small door in the basement that led to an underground tunnel. According to Tom's parents, the tunnel was built during Prohibition, back when the house was used as a speakeasy. They had it sealed off when they moved in, but we were always fascinated by it. One night, when we were about 15, Tom and I decided to sneak down to the basement and explore the tunnel. Armed with flashlights and a crowbar, we pried open the old door and stepped inside. The air was stale and thick with dust, and the faint smell of earth filled our lungs. The walls were rough stone, covered in cobwebs, and as we walked further in, our footsteps echoed eerily. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, and with each step, we felt like we were walking deeper into some hidden past. Suddenly, Tom stopped, pointing his flashlight at something on the wall. There, etched into the stone, were dozens of tally marks, all lined up in neat rows. Beneath the marks, someone had scrawled a message in a shaky hand, one each day until I'm free. We both stared at each other, nervous laughter covering up the growing fear. Then we heard a soft whisper, like someone was breathing right behind us. We spun around, shining our flashlights wildly, but the tunnel was empty. We bolted back to the basement and slammed the door shut, breathing heavily, our hearts racing. Neither of us ever went back down there, and Tom's family ended up moving a few years later. But that night, whenever I think back on it, I can still hear that faint whisper echoing in the tunnel as if something